I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sliver of opening, no wider than a finger, was an aperture into the ruin of my life, a narrow channel through which the clipped, anxious tones of my father and the brittle, insistent whispers of my stepmother flowed like a poison. They spoke of me as one would speak of a problematic piece of livestock, a creature to be bartered or disposed of with the least possible inconvenience. It was a familiar feeling, this sense of being an object in my own home, a piece of furniture that had ceased to be useful and was now merely in the way.
"There is no other choice,"
my father, Baron Ashworth, said, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of its usual blustering authority.
"Rosamond has made her bed.
She has run off with that penniless lieutenant, and in doing so has signed our death warrant." "Do not be so dramatic, Alistair," my stepmother, Lady Beatrice, countered, her voice a silken rasp. "The warrant is not signed until the Duke of Alistair signs it. He holds the contract. He holds all your debts. He was promised a bride, and a bride he shall have." A terrible silence followed, a void in which I could feel the shape of their next thought forming. I stood frozen in the dim hallway, my hand clutching a book of poetry so tightly my knuckles were white. The book was my only true companion, its verses a sanctuary from the harsh prose of my existence. I was Ilara, the first daughter, the plain one, the one whose dowry was a pittance, and whose future was a subject of polite, pitying speculation at tea tables across the county. I was the shadow from which my sister Rosamond, a creature of sunlight and laughter and breathtaking beauty, had always emerged, making her own radiance all the more dazzling by comparison. I was too quiet, they said, too serious. My nose was a fraction too long, my eyes a shade of brown too common to hold any man's interest for long. I preferred the company of dusty tomes to that of dashing young men, a failing my stepmother considered tantamount to heresy. "Ilara?" my father finally breathed, the name a question mark hanging in the air. "Her?" Beatrice's reply was a small, sharp laugh, like the snap of a dry twig. "Alistair, be serious. He is the Duke of Alistair. He was promised a diamond, and you propose to send him a common river stone? He will take one look at her and send her back, and then he will call in the markers, and we shall be utterly, completely ruined." "What else can we do?" he pleaded. "The contract stipulates a daughter of my house. It does not specify which one. It is a loophole, perhaps our only one. We send her." We explained that Rosamond was taken ill, indisposed. We play for time. They were not just planning to barter me. They were building my cage out of lies. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the draughty corridors of Ashworth Manor. I was to be the sacrifice placed on the altar of my family's folly, a desperate gambit to appease a fearsome, unknown god, the Duke of Alistair. I knew the name, of course, everyone did. He was a creature of myth as much as man, a figure of immense wealth and power who lived in self-imposed exile on his vast, remote estate, Blackwood Manor. It was said he had never recovered from the death of his young wife years ago, that he was a man carved from ice and shadow, severe and unyielding. And it was to this man they intended to send me, a plain brown sparrow, to take the place of a golden canary. I did not wait to hear more. I retreated on silent feet, the book of poetry now feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. I went to my room, a small, cold chamber overlooking a patch of neglected garden, and I sat on the edge of my narrow bed. I did not cry. Tears were a currency I could not afford to spend. Instead, a strange and terrible calm settled over me. For my entire life I had been overlooked, a ghost at my own family's feast. Now I was to be seen at last, but only as a pawn in a game I had no hope of winning. They were sending me into the dragon's lair, and they did not even have the decency to feel remorse. They felt only fear for themselves. 2 days later, it was done. My stepmother explained the situation to me with a performance of strained maternal concern that was more insulting than open contempt would have been. She spoke of duty, of family honour, of the terrible predicament Rosamond's foolishness had placed them in. I listened with a placid expression, my face a carefully constructed mask of obedience. My acquiescence seemed to relieve her. She likely mistook my silence for docility, my stillness for acceptance. She did not see the core of iron that was hardening within me, a resolve forged in years of quiet observation and lonely resilience. I would go, but I would not be their meek little sacrifice. I would be myself, and if the Duke of Alastair chose to destroy me for it, then so be it. It was a better fate than slowly fading into nothingness at Ashworth Manor. The journey to Blackwood was a long and dreary affair, a rattling carriage ride through leagues of desolate, wind-swept moorland that seemed to grow more forbidding with every mile. The landscape was a mirror to my own heart, vast, empty, and touched by a deep, abiding melancholy. When the manor finally came into view, it did not rise from the earth so much as claw its way out, a jagged silhouette of dark stone and Gothic spires against a bruised purple sky. It was a fortress, not a home, built to keep the world at bay. A severe, rail-thin housekeeper with a face like pinched parchment, who introduced herself as Mistress Gable, led me through halls that echoed with the ghosts of silence. There were no portraits on the walls, no flowers in the vases, no signs of life or warmth. It was a place of suspended animation, a grand mausoleum for a man whose heart had apparently died long ago. She showed me to a suite of rooms in a wing that felt cold and disused, the furniture shrouded in white cloths like sleeping spectres. "His Grace will see you in the library in 1 hour," she announced, her voice devoid of any inflection. Then she left me alone with my valise and the suffocating silence. I prepared myself as one might for an execution. I washed my face in the cold water from the porcelain basin and changed into my best dress, a simple gown of dark blue wool that did little to flatter but was at least respectable. I looked at my reflection in the tarnished mirror. The girl who stared back was pale and serious, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. A river stone, my stepmother had called me. Very well. Stones were not beautiful, but they were strong. They endured. The library was the one room in the house that felt alive. It was a magnificent 2-story chamber, walled with books from floor to ceiling. A fire roared in a cavernous hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the spines of countless volumes. And there, standing before the fire with his back to me, was the Duke. He was taller than I had imagined, his shoulders broad beneath a perfectly tailored black coat. He did not turn as I entered, and I was forced to stand awkwardly in the doorway, my presence announced only by the soft click of the closing door. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he turned. My breath caught in my throat. I had expected a monster, or at least a man ravaged by grief. The Duke of Alistair was neither. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, his jaw firm, his mouth a thin, unsmiling slash. But his eyes, a startling shade of grey like a winter storm at sea, were not cold. They were watchful and weary, a deep weariness that seemed to bone deep. Dark hair, untouched by grey, was brushed back from a high forehead. He was not handsome in the classical sense, but he possessed a raw, intimidating power that was more compelling than mere good looks. He let his gaze sweep over me, a slow, deliberate assessment that missed nothing, from my mended gloves to the nervous way I held my hands clasped before me. I braced myself for the dismissal, the scorn, the cold fury. I had my speech prepared. A quiet, dignified explanation of who I was and why I was there. But he spoke first, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no trace of surprise.
"You are not Rosamond Ashworth,"
he stated. It was not a question. "No, Your Grace," I managed, my own voice sounding small in the vast room. "I am her sister, Ilara." He continued to look at me, and it was here that the moment shifted, that the world tilted on its axis. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman's eyes, but a direct and penetrating gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of my carefully constructed composure. He was not looking at my plain dress or my unremarkable face. He was looking at me. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something I could not name. Curiosity? Analysis? Passing through their stormy depths. He saw the book I still clutched in my hand, the volume of Seneca I had brought for the journey. His gaze lingered on it for a second before returning to my face. It felt as though he were reading the lines of my soul as easily as he might read the text on a page. In that single, unnerving moment, I felt more seen than I had in my entire life. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling I had ever known. He did not send me away. This, in itself, was a profound shock, a disruption of the narrative my family had written for me. He simply gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit," he commanded, the word less a suggestion than a statement of fact. He informed me that I would remain at Blackwood while he considered the ramifications of my father's breach of contract. The days that followed were a study in suspense. I lived in a state of limbo, a guest who was also a prisoner, a potential bride who was also a piece of collateral. I took my meals alone in a cavernous dining hall, served by silent footmen. I spent my hours in the vast, cold suite of rooms assigned to me, or walking in the windswept gardens where the statues wore cloaks of moss and ivy. But every afternoon, at precisely 3 o'clock, a footman would appear at my door with a message. "His Grace requests your presence in the library." These meetings became the strange, magnetic centre of my days. At first, they were exercises in strained formality. We would sit in 2 large leather armchairs by the fire, a vast expanse of rug between us, and he would ask me questions. They were not the polite, meaningless queries of a drawing-room conversation. He asked about my education, about the books I had read, about my opinions on matters of agriculture and history. He listened, truly listened to my answers, his grey eyes fixed on my face, with that same unnerving intensity I had seen on the first day. Slowly, hesitantly, I began to talk. I spoke of the philosophies of the Stoics, of the crop rotation methods I had read about in my father's neglected farming journals, of the subtle beauties in the poetry of poets he too admired. A conversation that began as an interrogation gradually, imperceptibly, transformed into a dialogue. I discovered he possessed a formidable intellect, a mind as sharp and uncompromising as his features. He would challenge my arguments, present counterpoints, and push me to defend my positions with logic and reason. No one had ever spoken to me this way. No one had ever treated my thoughts as something worthy of serious consideration. It was intoxicating. One afternoon, we were discussing a passage from Virgil's Georgics. "My father believes poetry has no place in the practical world," I remarked, a hint of old bitterness creeping into my voice. The Duke looked up from the book he held. "Your father is a fool," he said, the statement delivered with such matter-of-fact finality that I was momentarily stunned into silence. He did not say it to flatter me, but as a simple, observable truth, like stating that the sky was grey. It was in that moment I realised he saw my family for exactly what they were, and that my presence here was not something he held against me. The chill of the manor was a constant, seeping thing, a damp cold that even the roaring library fire could not fully banish. My rooms, situated in the unused eastern wing, were particularly frigid. I spent my nights huddled under a thin collection of blankets, my breath misting in the air. I never complained. It was not my place. But one morning I opened my door to find a neat stack of dry, split firewood piled on the flagstones, along with a thick, heavy shawl of dark green wool. It was of the finest quality, soft and incredibly warm. There was no note, no explanation. The servants, when I inquired, were models of perfect ignorance. But I knew it was his doing. The thought of this severe, intimidating man noticing my discomfort and arranging in his silent, indirect way for my comfort sent a strange and unfamiliar warmth spreading through my chest, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire I was now able to build. It was an act of secret kindness, a gesture more eloquent than 1,000 pretty compliments. Our intellectual intimacy grew, but a chasm of physical distance and formal etiquette remained between us. Until one rainy afternoon in the library. We were both standing before a high shelf, searching for a particular atlas. We saw it at the same time, our hands reaching for the heavy spine simultaneously. His fingers, long and cool, brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, no more than a whisper of touch, but it sent a jolt through me, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. I pulled my hand back as if burned. He froze, his own hand still on the book. The air between us grew thick and charged, humming with an unspoken awareness. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain against the tall, arched windows. He did not apologize or make a joke to ease the tension. He simply looked at me, his gaze dropping from my eyes to my mouth and back again. And in that look, I saw a flicker of something new, something that was not intellectual curiosity. It was a raw, unguarded hunger that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I was the first to break the spell, murmuring an apology and stepping back, my face flushed. But something had irrevocably shifted. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with a potent, dangerous possibility. A week later, after a long and intense discussion about the nature of justice and mercy, he set his book aside and looked at me across the hearth. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making him seem both formidable and strangely vulnerable.
I find the continued use of my title between us to be inefficient, he said, his voice a low rumble. You will call me Cassian. The request, phrased as a command, was a seismic event. It was a breach of every rule of propriety, a deliberate dismantling of the formal wall that separated a duke from a baron's penniless daughter. My mind raced. This was a line being crossed, a door being opened. I knew that if I walked through it, I could never go back. I met his gaze, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. Only, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, if you will call me Alara. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a minute upward curve that transformed his severe face entirely. As you wish, Alara. The sound of my own name on his lips was an intimacy more profound than any touch. It was an acknowledgement, a claiming. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the silent witness of 1,000 books, I allowed myself, for the very first time, to hope. The fragile hope that had taken root within me was a delicate, unseasonable flower, and it was destined to be crushed by the arrival of the post. A letter came, bearing my father's seal. I took it to my room, my hands trembling slightly as I broke the wax. I had expected a missive of inquiry, perhaps even a grudging apology. What I found instead was a document of our damnation. My father, in a panicked, rambling script, laid bare the full, wretched truth of the marriage contract. It was not merely an agreement to trade a daughter for the forgiveness of debt. It contained a punitive clause, a cruel piece of legal artistry designed to ensure my family's complete and utter ruin should the agreement be broken. If the Duke refused the offered bride, or if the bride herself fled or was deemed unsuitable, my father's entire estate, Ashworth Manor, and all its lands would be forfeit to the Duke of Alastair, immediately and without recourse. Rosamond's elopement had not just jeopardized their finances, it had triggered a guillotine poised to fall. I was not a substitute bride. I was the final, desperate offering to stop the blade. I was not a person to them at all, but a deed, a title, a last-ditch effort to keep a roof over their heads. The words on the page blurred. A cold sickness washed over me, chilling me more deeply than the Manor's ever-present drafts. Every moment of the past weeks replayed in my mind, twisted and poisoned by this new knowledge. Cassian's patience, his conversations, his intellectual engagement, were they all a charade? Was his kindness, the firewood, the shawl, the startling intimacy of his name on my lips,
Nothing more than a calculated strategy to keep me docile, to ensure his acquisition of my father's property. The man who saw me, who spoke to my mind and not my face. Was he just a clever businessman securing his investment? The pain of it was a physical thing, a sharp, brutal blow to the heart. The humiliation was worse. I had allowed myself to feel seen, to feel valued, and it had all been a lie, a meticulously crafted illusion. The Riverstone had foolishly believed it was being polished into a gem, when all along it was simply being weighed on a scale. I did not weep. My grief was too cold, too hard for tears. It solidified into a shard of ice in my chest. I folded the letter, my movements stiff and precise, and walked with a steady, determined gait toward the library. He was there, as he always was in the late afternoon, a book open on his lap. He looked up as I entered, a question in his eyes at my unannounced arrival. I did not offer a greeting. I walked to the centre of the room and held out the letter. "My father is a fool," I said, my voice a dead, flat thing. "But he is not nearly as cruel as you are, Your Grace." The use of his title was a deliberate strike, a rebuilding of the wall he had invited me to tear down. A flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps hurt, crossed his face before his expression hardened into its familiar, severe mask. He did not take the letter. "I am aware of your father's character," he said, his tone clipped. "Are you?" I pressed, my voice gaining a tremor of the fury that was boiling beneath my frozen composure. "Are you aware that this contract makes me little more than chattel? That my presence here is the only thing standing between my family and utter destitution? Did you know, when you sat here discussing philosophy with me, that you were holding a sword over my head the entire time?" He rose slowly from his chair, his height and presence suddenly seeming immense, threatening. "I did not ask for your opinion on the terms of the contract, Miss Ashworth." The cold, formal dismissal was the final straw. All my pain, my humiliation, my rage coalesced into a single point of sharp, defiant clarity. "That was your first mistake," I answered, my voice ringing with a strength I did not know I possessed. "You should have. You should have asked what I thought, but you saw only a name on a piece of paper, a clause in a contract. You saw a means to an end." He took a step toward me, his grey eyes blazing with an emotion I could not decipher. "You are wrong," he said, his voice low and intense. "When I signed that contract, I saw only business, a foolish man's debt, a way to acquire a neighbouring property I have long desired. I expected your sister, a beautiful, empty-headed girl I intended to install here and then ignore for the rest of our lives. That was the plan. Everything was business." He gestured around the vast, silent library. "The debt, the contract, my entire life. It was all a catastrophe I had carefully managed." He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was standing only an arm's length away. "I did not plan for you," he whispered, the words raw and torn from him. "I did not plan for your mind, or your courage, or the way you look at a line of poetry as if it holds the secrets of the universe. I did not plan for the first interesting conversation I have had in a decade. You, Elara, were the catastrophe I did not plan for." His confession hung in the air, a shocking, vulnerable admission that shattered my anger and left me reeling. He had known. He had known everything. And yet, the pain in his voice, the raw honesty in his eyes, felt undeniably real. Before I could formulate a response, before my mind could reconcile the calculating Duke with the tormented man standing before me, he turned and walked to the massive oak desk that dominated one corner of the room. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a sheaf of papers bound with a ribbon. He did not hand them to me. He laid them on the desk and stepped back, inviting me to view them. I approached with trepidation. They were legal documents, covered in the dense, looping script of a solicitor. As I scanned the first page, my breath hitched. It was a new agreement, a loan document. It restructured my father's entire debt into a long-term, low-interest loan with manageable quarterly payments. It made no mention of marriage, no mention of land, no mention of me. It was dated 2 days ago. He had done this before my father's letter ever arrived. He had already set me free. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with disbelief and 1,000 unspoken questions. "I had my solicitor draw it up last week," Cassian said, his voice quiet now, devoid of its earlier harshness. "I was going to present it to you. I was trying to find the right time, the right words. I wanted you to understand that your presence here, it had ceased to be about the contract. It had started to be about everything else." He moved from behind the desk, coming to stand before me once more. The formidable Duke was gone, replaced by a man whose vulnerability was a shield laid at my feet. This house was a tomb, Elara. I was a ghost within it. For 10 years, I have done nothing but exist, managing my estates, managing my grief, managing my silence. It was orderly, it was controlled, it was empty. His stormy grey eyes held mine, and I saw in their depths a profound and aching loneliness that mirrored my own. And then you arrived. You walked into this library, clutching your book like a shield, and you met my gaze without flinching. You filled the silence not with chatter, but with thought. You brought this house and me back to life. The thought of acquiring your father's lands now feels like a paltry, meaningless thing. Because I find, his voice dropped, becoming thick with emotion, that I am utterly unwilling to let you leave. The confession was a key turning in a lock I had not known was rusted shut within my own heart. The carefully constructed walls around my emotions, built over a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued, crumbled into dust. He had not been playing me. He had been seeing me. He had seen past the plain face and the poor dowry and the desperate circumstances, and he had seen the woman I had always hoped I could be. "Cassian," I breathed, the name feeling both strange and perfectly natural on my lips. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and laid my hand on his arm. The fine wool of his coat was a coarse reality beneath my touch. I thought—" "I know what you thought," he said gently. "I gave you every reason to. Forgive me. My habit of hiding my heart is a difficult one to break." In that moment, I understood him. He was not a man of ice and shadow, but a man who had built a fortress of it around himself to protect a heart that had been shattered once before. And I, in my quiet, unassuming way, had somehow found the gate. I looked from the legal documents that offered my family salvation to the man who offered me a home for my soul, and I knew my choice had already been made. "There is nothing to forgive," I said, my voice soft but sure. And as I spoke the words, I solidified not just our alliance, but the foundation of a future I had never dared to imagine. The arrival of my father and stepmother 2 weeks later was an inevitability I had been dreading and, in a strange way, preparing for. They swept into Blackwood Manor like a conquering army that had mistaken the terms of surrender. Beatrice's face alight with triumphant avarice, and my father's puffed up with a restored, if precarious, sense of importance. They had clearly received word that I had not been sent packing, and had drawn the most favourable conclusion: that their desperate gambit had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Cassian had insisted we receive them together, in the grand drawing-room, a cavernous space I had not yet entered, furnished with intimidatingly formal pieces still draped in their dust covers. At his instruction, the covers had been removed and a fire lit in the grate, the stage meticulously set for the final act of this miserable play. We stood side by side near the hearth as they were announced, a silent, united front. "Elara, my dear!" Beatrice exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace me, her hug as brittle and insincere as her smile. "You look, well, the country air agrees with you. And your grace," she turned to Cassian, offering a deep, practised curtsy. "We are so profoundly grateful. You have been most understanding about our little family crisis." She was already taking ownership of the situation, positioning herself as the orchestrator of this grand victory. She spoke of the wedding plans as if they were a settled matter, chattering about guest lists and suitable gowns, all while pointedly ignoring the fact that she had intended for my sister to be the one standing here. My father hovered behind her, nodding and making noises of pompous agreement. "My daughter has always been a quiet, dutiful girl," my father boomed, directing his words to Cassian. "She knows her place. She will make a fine, biddable duchess." The words were meant as a compliment, a final selling point for his wares, but they landed on me with the force of a physical blow. A biddable girl who knew her place. That was all I had ever been to him. I felt Cassian tense beside me, a subtle shift of weight, a hardening of the line of his jaw. Beatrice, sensing an opportunity to cement her authority, turned to me. "Of course, Elara, you will need guidance. The running of a household this size, it is quite beyond your experience. I shall, naturally, stay on for a time to assist you." She patted my arm in a gesture of condescending ownership. "You have done well, child. You have saved us." That was the moment the Riverstone refused to be moved by the current any longer. Before Cassian could speak, I took a small step forward, disengaging myself from my stepmother's touch. "I have done nothing of the sort," I said, my voice quiet, yet it cut through Beatrice's chatter like a shard of glass. The room fell silent. Both my father and stepmother stared at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and nascent irritation. It was likely the first time in my life I had ever contradicted them so directly. "Elara, do not be foolish," Beatrice snapped, her mask of pleasantry slipping. "She is not being foolish," Cassian's voice boomed, startling them. He moved to stand slightly in front of me,
a protective gesture that was as clear as a drawn sword. He held a familiar sheaf of papers in his hand. She is being honest. There will be no wedding under the terms of the old contract, because the old contract no longer exists. He extended the documents to my father. This is a new agreement, Baron, a simple loan. Your debts are restructured. Your estate is safe. There is no longer any marriage obligation between our houses. My father took the papers, his hands trembling as he stared at the legal script, his face draining of all colour. Beatrice snatched them from him, her sharp eyes scanning the page. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. "What is this? What have you done?" she shrieked, turning on me. "You foolish girl! You had him! You had a duke!"
"You have ruined everything." "On the contrary," I said, finding my strength in Cassian's steadfast presence beside me. "I have secured it. I have secured my own future, one that I will decide. I am not a prize to be won, stepmother. I am not a debt to be paid. And I will not be a biddable girl who knows her place in anyone's house, least of all my own." I looked at my father, at his stunned, slack-jawed face, and I felt not anger, but a deep, hollow pity. "I have spent my life in your shadow, father, waiting to be seen. I see now that you were never capable of looking. You saw only my utility, my cost. I hope, for your sake, that the price of your estate is worth the cost of your daughter." The defeat was total and absolute. There were no more arguments to be made, no more manipulations to be wrought. They were socially and financially checkmated. Cassian dismissed them with a cold, final nod to a waiting footman. They were escorted out of the drawing-room, their grand entrance culminating in a humiliating, silent retreat. As the heavy doors closed behind them, a profound silence descended, leaving just the two of us standing in the firelight. I was shaking, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving me weak-kneed. I had spoken my truth, and the world had not ended. In fact, it felt as if it were just beginning. Cassian turned to me, his severe face softened with an expression of such profound tenderness that it took my breath away. He did not speak. He simply reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. "There is no obligation," he murmured, his voice husky, repeating his earlier words, but imbuing them now with a new, deeper meaning. "But there is my heart, Ilara, and it is, and always will be, yours to command. Will you marry me? Not as a duchess, but as my wife. Not to run my house, but to share my life." Tears I had refused to shed in grief now fell freely in joy. I leaned into his touch, a feeling of coming home washing over me, so powerful it was a physical sensation. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Cassian." He lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, reverent certainty. It was a kiss that tasted of silent libraries and warm fires, of loneliness found and solace given. It was the kiss of a man who had seen the river stone and had recognized the diamond within. We were married 3 months later at the small chapel on the Blackwood estate as the first snows of winter began to dust the moors. It was a quiet ceremony attended only by a handful of loyal staff and Cassian's solicitor. I did not need a crowd. The only witness I required was the man who stood before me, his stormy eyes filled with a calm, steady light. Blackwood Manor was transformed. Or perhaps it was simply that I now saw it through the lens of love. Sunlight, even the pale, watery sunlight of winter, seemed to find its way into the once shadowed corners. We had fires lit in every room, and the scent of beeswax and old paper was joined by the fragrance of the flowers I now insisted on arranging in every vase. Mistress Gable, the severe housekeeper, had unbent so far as to offer me a small, genuine smile one morning, an event so startling it felt like a miracle. Her approval was a quiet but powerful blessing. I received a letter from Rosamond, filled with remorse and a surprisingly insightful self-awareness. She was happy, she wrote, with her lieutenant, though they were terribly poor. She apologised for her selfishness, for the cage she had fled that I had been thrown into. I wrote back, forgiving her freely. Our lives were on different paths now, and I wished her nothing but peace. One evening, I was curled in my favourite armchair in the library, a book lying open but unread in my lap. The fire crackled and hissed, a cheerful counterpoint to the wind howling outside. Cassian sat across from me, not reading, but simply watching me, a faint, contented smile on his lips. He was no longer a creature of myth or a man of ice. He was my husband, my partner, my friend. I thought back to the girl who had stood in the cold hallway of Ashworth Manor, listening to her fate being decided by people who had never truly known her. She had felt so small, so powerless, so invisible. She had been sent to a fortress to be a sacrifice, and had found instead a sanctuary. She had been sent to a man's prison, and had discovered it was her own heart's home. "What are you thinking about?" Cassian asked, his voice a warm, familiar comfort. I smiled, meeting his gaze across the hearth. "I was just thinking," I said, "that my father was wrong. Poetry has a great deal to do with the practical world. Sometimes it is the only thing that makes any sense of it at all." He rose and came to me, kneeling by my chair and taking my hand in his. He lifted it to his lips, his eyes never leaving mine. In that look, I saw my past, my present, and all of our beautiful, unwritten tomorrows. I was no longer the plain sister, the second daughter, the river stone. I was Ilara, Duchess of Alistair. I was beloved, and I was, finally, and completely, seen.